Hi, well, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for watching this YouTube video of mine. Thank you for visiting my channel. As always, feel free to hit the like and subscribe button below, even leave some comments below as well if you like. And yes, as usual, of course, I'm Hirsch Saha, the one and only Hirsch Saha, reporting from Auckland, New Zealand. Today is Friday. It's Friday afternoon. I finally got some spare time to actually add a couple more videos this week. Normally, as you've probably noticed, I add about two videos each week, but I got a bit of extra time this week, and I just sort of felt a little bit in the mood. Normally, real life gets in the way of these sort of things, as always. You've heard the saying, life gets in the way of living. But I got a bit of extra time, so I thought I'd add maybe one or two more videos this week. Yep, so today is Friday, the 12th of June, 2026, reporting from Auckland, New Zealand. Yes, so that title probably appealed to you at least somewhat. Did we land on the moon or didn't we? Yes, probably one of the oldest debates and probably one of the most popular of all conspiracy theories. Now, I'm not saying that I have the final answer or that I've done all the research, looked at everything, but hopefully what I tell you today will really help you to make up your mind on the matter. Of course, you always have the freedom to choose at the end of the day, and I do feel that everyone is entitled to their own opinion on everything. I really do feel that. So basically, as of course what history tells us, is that the Americans were the first to send a man to the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, that landed on the moon on the 20th of July, 1969, in their Apollo 11 vessel to the moon during the Apollo space missions. You might recall, or you might remember from history, that it was in 1961, on the 12th of April 1961, that the Soviets, because back in those days the two superpowers were the United States and the Soviet Union, and on the 12th of April 1961, the Soviet Union was the first to send a man in space. Yuri Gagarin, in space. He circumnavigated, well, circled the Earth, orbited the Earth, and landed back in the Soviet Union, safe and sound, after a flight time of about 109 minutes. And after that happened in April 1961, after the Soviets were still ahead in the so-called space race, which was, what they called that part of the Cold War between the two world superpowers at the time, when the Soviet Union had been the first to send a satellite into space and the first to send a man into space, amongst many other firsts, which I've detailed in previous videos, you might remember. The Americans were obviously a bit embarrassed, felt a bit behind, and they were like, okay, we really have to kick the Soviet Union's ass once and for all. We really have to be first in everything. And it was John F. Kennedy, President of the United States at the time, who gave that famous speech on the steps of Rice University. I believe this nation should commit itself, of achieving the feat, before this decade is out, meaning the 1960s, of sending a man to the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And that speech was made in May 1961, 1 month after the Soviets first sent a man into space, and just after the Americans managed to catch up and also send a man into space. The second man sent to space, the first American sent to space, and oh, the name's just escaped me at the moment. The name has just escaped me at the moment. But yes, they sent him into space, and he just did, while Yuri Gagarin, the first Soviet Russian into space, circled the Earth, orbited the Earth. The first American in space, the second man in space, he just did a suborbital loop, going up and just above the atmosphere, hitting space, and then coming down again. And he only spent 15 minutes in space. Yes, the name's now come back to me, Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard, the first American in space. So, the Americans set themselves the so-called, pretty much arguably, especially at the time, impossible feat of being the first to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before that decade was out, with the deadline pretty much being the 31st of December 1969. The Soviets had also planned to send a man to the moon, and actually they had planned to do it earlier. They wanted to do it by October 1967 to mark the 50th anniversary of the October 1917 Bolshevik or Communist Revolution. So they actually aimed to do it then, and unfortunately they had failed. They had tried with their own rockets, but they had failed, and there were also problems with the bureaucracy and the politics in the Soviet Union and the Soviet space program at the time, which I have detailed in a previous talk video. But coming back to it, so we are told that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin successfully landed on the moon on the 20th of July, 1969. And conspiracy theorists since then, not only today, but have poked holes in that so-called achievement. Did it really happen? And I'm sure you've heard about it as well. And the only real solid proof the Americans have of having been to the moon or sent men to the moon back in July 1969 is basically the photos and the footage they have of landing on the moon and walking on the moon, exploring the moon, things like that. Yes, they brought rock samples back, but even those rock samples, I'm sure, could always be you know, disputed. You could, I guess, they could be faked. They could be rocks from just some remote place on Earth or some sort of alien-like environment or some very hostile environment. And it's like, oh, look, these are rocks from the moon, but how do you know they're really from the moon, right? I do know that MythBusters in one of their episodes also tried to bust, if you like, this myth, and they concluded that the Americans did land a man on the moon because they said that when the Americans went there, they left reflector lights on the surface of the moon. And what Mythbusters did is that they shone light to those reflectors and they reflected the light back, meaning that Americans landed on the moon. I personally don't buy that completely because those reflector lights could have simply been left by probes, right? Doesn't mean that men actually landed on the moon. Some other conspiracy theorists have said that, look, to prove it once and for all, we really have to go to the moon, either a manned mission or an unmanned mission, a probe. And we really need to see that when the Eagle had landed, the landing module with the men in it, and it left those landing legs there on the moon, that those landing legs are still there on the moon, as well as the footprints left by the astronauts, and of course the American flag there on the moon. Even if the flag has fallen down and is half covered in dust or what have you, it would still be proof, right? That if it's in the exact location they said, it would still be proof that they landed on the moon. And it's quite interesting because from what I've heard, no one has actually done that, whether a private or a government run space program. No one has actually done that, not even sending, you don't have to send men to the moon or people to the moon, not even sending, a probe to just orbit the moon and photograph that. Currently, there is no telescope on Earth strong enough to see that far into the moon and to see whether those landing legs and the flag and the footprints are left there. So you'd really have to send a probe to the moon to go into low lunar or low moon orbit and to photograph that from space, if not landing on the moon. But even then, you run the risk of if you're able to land it very close to where the Americans landed. So it really does intrigue me that no one's actually done that yet. And if anything, sometimes you can't help but wonder, is that sort of contributing to the side of the argument that they never made it to the moon? But okay, coming back to the popular arguments, against, the conspiracy theory of men having never been to the moon, at least back in the 1960s with the American Apollo space mission. They said that, look, when they planted the flag on the moon, the flag is waving as if it's in wind. But of course, there's no wind on the moon. So how can that be, Even if they filmed it here in a studio on Earth, as the conspiracy theorists believe, of course the studio would be indoors and away from the wind. But what the people who support the argument that we did land on the moon, what they say is that when they planted the flag, the American flag on the moon, because they were installing it well into the ground and twisting it in such a way that the flag kept flapping. And because there's no air on the moon, no oxygen, no air resistance, there's no air resistance to immediately stop the flag from flapping each way. That's why it kept flapping for quite a while until it eventually stopped. And therefore it appeared that it was in wind. But really that's just the way the environment is on the moon. Another argument is that, the astronauts couldn't have possibly survived the intense radiation of space, obviously coming from the sun, once you leave the so-called Van Allen belt, that safety belt that Earth has with its magnetic field that protects it from deadly solar radiation and cosmic rays and things like that. But the argument for that is simple. When they were in this traveling to the moon, they were safe in the space modules, and the space modules had were covered in thick enough layers to shield them from that radiation. And then when they were walking on the moon, they were protected by their spacesuits, which also were thick enough to again shield them from the radiation. It's not like they went to the moon and just went out in t-shirts, shorts, and sandals as if you were enjoying a day at the beach. They were always protected against that solar radiation. Not trying to deny the radiation, of course it's there, but they were always protected. There's the argument. There's a counter argument for that point. conspiracy theorists point out that when they landed on the moon, that with the landing legs of the Eagle, the lunar landing module, if I think that's what it's called, there should be so much of moon dust around it from and a blast crater, right? But the thing is that when they were landing on the moon and getting close to the ground, they were traveling quite slowly, and they didn't need much of a blast to to stop them and to successfully land on the surface of the moon. So therefore, you don't have a huge blast crater and you don't have a lot of dust. Also, as you'd expect on Earth, when there's a lot of dust from a blast or anything similar, obviously the dust gets caught up in the air and it takes time for the dust to settle, so to speak, and therefore it goes everywhere. But on the moon there is no air, so the dust would immediately pretty quickly fall down. And again, there wouldn't be as much of dust as you'd expect if you were landing on the surface of the Earth in comparison to the moon. Another point they say is that when they were walking on the moon, the background always seemed to be the same. The hills in the background, it always seemed to be the same, as if it's a fake background, added, as a wall, as a backdrop in a studio. And again, yes, that might sound like a good point, but the thing is that just like here on Earth, when you're traveling, say, across a road or across a highway or just any stretch of space, the background will always appear to be the same for a while, especially the distant background. Like, say, if you have mountains or hills in the background, it will always appear to be the same unless you traverse a huge distance, so the background significantly changes. The same was on the moon. Don't forget that when they landed on the moon in the first few missions, they were just walking around very close to where they landed and where they planted the flag. They were just walking around. It was only in later missions to the moon, they sent a total of 6 missions there. Therefore 12 men, 2 men each time. 12 men landed and walked on the moon. It was only in those later missions that they had that lunar rover. You might have seen in pictures, you might have even seen toys of it, the little lunar rover, which they sat in and were able to drive a little bit further from the landing site than before. But in the first missions, they only were able to walk around. So therefore, even with the lunar rover, they weren't able to travel that far. And of course, it ran on a battery, and they weren't able to charge it. And especially in those days, they needed battery power to go to a certain distance, and they could only use half the battery because they'll need the second half of the battery to come back, of course. So that's why the background always appears to be the same, because they just simply weren't able to traverse a long enough distance in order for that background to change. So then there's that argument. And then what are the other arguments? I think they were saying that it appears that, how come the surface of the moon is so brightly lit up? And if you look carefully at the rocks, there appear to be shadows going in different directions, which suggests artificial light sources, as you would expect, filming a movie here on Earth in a studio, artificial light sources. And of course, on the moon, the only main source of light is the sun. Yes, that is true. But what happened is that the people who argue that we did land on the moon say that the surface was so brightly lit up because the light from the sun came and hit the lunar landing module and the astronauts and their various equipment, most pretty much all made out of metal, and it reflected very well off those surfaces and onto the ground. And I'm sure they did have some artificial light sources to help them with their photography and filming as well. So that's why the surface of the moon appears quite bright, and you tend to have shadows from rocks going in different directions. To be honest, that one is not absolutely convincing to me personally, but I guess it is possible. Then what else were they saying? They were saying that um, it does seem quite, astonishing, quite surprising that when American rockets were just going up and then immediately coming down in flames, when they failed to send their first satellite into space, Kaputnik, you might remember that, from my previous a previous YouTube video. And they just seem to, and the huge failure of Apollo 1 in 1967, 2 years before they supposedly, or what history tells us, when they did land on the moon, Apollo 1, when Gus Grissom died, because it was actually a test they were doing, and Apollo 1 was still on the ground, safe on Earth, but there was a fire in the module which killed all 3 astronauts, including Gus Grissom, and they couldn't believe it. It was very embarrassing for them. It was simply because of a short. There was a leak in electrical wiring, and a spark escaped, and because it was so packed with oxygen, when the spark mixed with oxygen, you had fire. And in such a small space, it killed the astronauts, all 3 astronauts, pretty quickly. So you had failures like that in the American space program, but that still doesn't mean that, that they would fail getting to the moon 2 years later. There are so many examples of people who have failed so many times and then suddenly succeeded, or at the 11th hour worked very hard, very, very hard, and managed to get there. Perhaps through, of course, through hard work, perhaps through a bit of luck as well. But there are many examples of that have happened, perhaps even in your own life or people you know, also people I know as well. So I guess that is not impossible. That is not impossible. I remember actually hearing a somewhat similar story regarding the Maori people here in my country, New Zealand, the Maori people who are the indigenous people of New Zealand, who were here first in New Zealand before Abel Tasman discovered it in the 16, if I'm correct, the 16 or 1700s. And then, of course, the British came, I think, in the late 1700s and then colonized the land in the 1800s, signing the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 to basically make peace with the Maoris who were here and to share their land and resources and give them technology in exchange, things like that. There's actually a legend in Maori culture. Unfortunately, it's not proven, but I guess they can't prove it. There's a legend in Maori culture that of a man in the ancient Maoris who actually through his canoe sailed south from New Zealand and discovered a land covered in white. You know, and the Maoris are saying that, oh, that must have been Antarctica, right? What else could it have been? So they actually believe, if that legend is true, unfortunately they can't prove it, but if that legend is true, that the Maoris were actually the first to discover the frozen, icebound continent at the south pole of our planet, that he sailed south, even though, sailing south across the Southern Ocean, not only is it very, a huge distance, I think it's roughly about 2,000 Ks or kilometers from the southern tip of New Zealand to Antarctica. Not only is it a huge distance, it is also freezing, especially depending on what time of year it is. And of course, the Southern Ocean is very, very treacherous. And, skeptics are saying, oh, no, not in their tiny canoes. They couldn't have possibly sailed that far and discovered the frozen continent and sailed back and lived to tell the tale in their tiny canoes back in those days. No, the Antarctica was officially first discovered by British explorer Roald Amundsen in 1813, which is what history tells us. But again, you can never disprove that. I mean, that the Maoris were the first to discover Antarctica. It could be true. It could be true. You can never really, in the same way you can't prove it 100%, you can't disprove it either 100%. And I think the same thing goes with, the Apollo mission to the moon, landing there, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landing them there on the 20th of July, 1969. So that is basically, if I'm correct, those are basically the arguments, for and against us landing on the moon. What also they said, they've also said that they believe that there are some faults with the some of the pictures taken when they landed on the moon. They, those I think they're called crosshairs scattered over the film, like a grid, the crosshairs. Sometimes they appear to be behind an object. And why is that? And I think they were saying, if I'm correct, that that could have been done through later editing when they were trying to improve the photos and all that. On that note, another argument is that how can the photos always appear so perfect? It's clear, you can see it's sharp, it's clear, the lighting is fine, it's not overexposed or anything like that. How come all the photos, especially using 1960s technology, appear to be so perfect? Well, those are only the photos that they published. There were many, many other photos and footage which they gathered from landing on the moon, which they didn't publish because they basically screwed them up or they came out the wrong way, overexposed or blurry or too dark or things like that. Obviously, at the very end of the day, just like an edited film, you only see the best bits of every single, if you like, take, or every single scene. So yeah, those are basically the arguments for, whether or not we landed on the moon, from the skeptics who say we didn't land on the moon to those who are saying, no, we did land on the moon. And I guess, I know that's not the whole argument. That is what I remember from what I've read on it, from the research I've done on the subject. But hey, at the end of the day, you're free to choose yourself. You're open to your own opinion. I really do believe that everyone is entitled to their own opinion on everything. So hey, if you have any thoughts, let me know. Let me know in the comments below what you think. If you've got anything to add to what I've said, if I've missed anything, or if there's anything incorrect in what I'm saying, just like anytime, feel free to add it in the comments below. And of course, feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, thank you.